Hi everyone. I'm just going to give it a couple minutes just to let some people join. We're currently 1 minute past the hour. I'll give it till 3 minutes past, and then we'll kick off. Cheers. Hi guys, if you're just joining, we're just going to give it 1 more minute till 3 minutes past, just to let everyone filter through, get the last bite of their Pret sandwich, or if they're at home, maybe eggs on toast before we kick off. Okay, well, welcome everyone to a webinar that we're running from Engage Check and Engage IQ in partnership with Refract. Unsurprisingly, around SDRs and sales development, but specifically around kind of reducing ramp and churn in this area. It's probably pretty old news, right? That the kind of growth of the SDR role in the past 10 years has been pretty meteoric. Originally, if we rewind the clock, maybe 6 years or so, kind of viewed as a stepping stone into the AE role, but it's now kind of cemented its own place in the sales funnel. And many companies are frantically trying to hire for pretty much probably the newest piece of sales real estate. Prior to setting up this webinar, prior to today, I did a bit of research of just how many companies are currently searching for this role. And there are currently 36,000 SDR roles open on LinkedIn. And whilst I understand the main struggle for a lot of people is getting talent into the seats, one certainly untalked about aspect is how to reduce churn in this department. And how to reduce churn in this department, and ultimately how to keep SDRs motivated and wanting to learn. Because let's be honest, we all know it is a pretty testing job. Today, I'm joined by two people who, it's probably fair to say, have seen their fair share of early stage SDRs to help us unpack this topic and really how to get the most out of them in that critical kind of 6 month period, but also up to kind of 12 months and beyond. First off, we've got Callum Henderson, Commercial Director at Engage Tech. It's probably fair to say he's seen more about kind of the trials and the tribulations of the SDR role than most, having had a first-hand role in training almost probably more than 300 through the door at Engage Check and IQ over the years. And secondly, we're joined by Rich Smith, Sales Director at Refract. Rich is well known in the industry, and by the nature of kind of the software at Refract, he's probably listened to more SDR pitches than most people have had hot dinners. Probably listened to his fair share of high quality pitches, but even more so the ones that maybe end with the phone going down or the prospect peeved, let's say. Callum, do you just want to intro a bit more about Engage Tech, IQ, and what we do and your role in it to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Freddie. I'd describe Engage Tech as a sales development agency. We operate only in the B2B tech sector. What that really means is you can come to us and hire an SDR that operates within our team. We'll underwrite a commitment of what they can deliver for our customers. Secondly, you could plug an SDR within your team into the data set that we have, and that's essentially the Engage IQ product. The real concept there is reducing the data connect for reps, and we'll a bit more on that later and how important that can be. And lastly, we also provide a bit of consultancy if you want to grow your own in-house team. I think the long and the short of it is we do outbound sales development. We love it. We know how difficult it can be, and we just try and help companies to do it more successfully. With respect to my role here, just try and make us 1% better on as many things as possible every day. So how I view it.
Nice. Cheers, Callum. Yeah, from my experience, possibly more than 1% sometimes as well. And Rich, yourself, do you want to intro Refract and your role there?
Yeah, appreciate that. Good to be here, guys. So Refract is, I guess, part of a wider organization called Allego, who are playing the sales enablement and readiness space, ultimately providing a platform that enables salespeople to be armed with all of the things that they need to be successful in their daily workflows, from content management, learning, crowdsourced learning from the sales team. A big piece of that as well is historically was called Refract, which is the conversation intelligence, which is really about analyzing conversations that sellers are having every single day with prospects and customers, understanding what's working in those conversations, what isn't, and helping organizations build a culture of actually improving performance through improving those conversations. My role here is I'm one of the original co-founders of Refract, run the sales team here in the UK as part of this wider organization, and super passionate about the whole topic of onboarding, enabling, making sellers successful, particularly in the early stages of their career.
Brilliant. Cheers. Well, certainly we've got a wealth of experience on this call, and I'll do my best to kind of chair it and keep us on topic. But one area that I think it was worth talking about is just kind of setting the scene of why is kind of this reducing the ramp and churn in this department so important. And one thing that I know that I come up again quite a lot is as well, probably historic of seeing that SDR role as the stepping stone. It's just how much SDRs are costing a business. Why you would want to kind of get ROI out of them so fast, and to be able to talk about that ROI, I think we need to talk a bit about exactly how much it costs for a business. EngageTech over the years have done some research, and also we've been backed by other research to kind of get under the skin of like the true costs of hiring an SDR. Our figures come out to kind of like £95,000 plus per hire, and you can see kind of a breakdown of the main cost there. Callum, you obviously are very apt to having conversations with people around this cost. So they're costs that kind of are surprising to people when you're talking about this, or are most people familiar with just the burden on the business from this team?
The first thing I'm going to say about this slide is the use of the word often. I would change that to always. The true cost of an SDR is always more than people estimate. But I don't know. I think you get quite a broad range. We get good exposure to this based on the fact that we are essentially trying to explain to someone that outsourcing this is as valuable as owning it, at least in the EngageTech part of the business. I'm surprised at how often a business owner will say, I can hire someone for this amount of money, and why would I consider a service that is X amount more? And that's normally the one that's most like, oh God, like, so I find that surprising that the wider costs to a business aren't considered. I think it makes sense more so in a larger company where you might be engaging with someone that doesn't actually see like the profit and loss sheet. But yeah, that's the point that most often kind of shocks me when I speak to business owners who don't view it as like a package.
Rich, having been at Refract, the kind of a Lego group company for so long, is it something you learned the hard way, or were you always aware of the kind of like the cost of setting up these divisions?
I think it was probably tune into it, and maybe more so than most because I'm kind of heavily getting involved with actually trying to make these people successful. Is I think when you do that, you have more of an appreciation of the cost to your time to make them successful, what they are contributing every day, even if that's in small increments. Whereas I think a lot of companies, they kind of see placement fee, a salary, and they kind of see that as the raw cost, and so they may a little bit more cut off from the reality of what that person needs to be successful. And you put down there, for example, on your page around like licenses as an example, like tools. Companies are investing heavily in their tech stack for their sales team. It's almost one of the biggest items that you see on the screen there. Because actually, there's a recognition that these tools can help people be successful. But I think where we're going to hopefully get to in this is that a lot of people probably aren't really truly aware of the overall cost to hire someone for a role, which is often seen as like the entry stage into to sales. But what they're not doing is thinking about how can I get my maximum ROI on that investment, because it's a big cost, right? And I think people aren't necessarily thinking of that too much. It's not a big cost when you can see what they can pay back, but I don't think people are maybe thinking about that too much.
Sure, you kind of rightfully picked out the kind of licenses side of that and the software side. It certainly feels like sales tech is maybe 3 years behind where kind of Martech is. I feel like in marketing department, it's very useful now to have 5-10 different softwares to help them. And it certainly felt like, from my perspective, in the last couple of years, there's been a shift from sales teams maybe being given a phone contract with 3 and yellow pages, maybe not so much, but a CRM, to change to now there's on the sales enablement piece. I mean, your tool, for example, is something that wasn't around maybe eight years ago, and similar with Engage IQ. Teams are now expected to be armed with like 4, 5 upwards tools at any one time. Have you guys seen that change?
Yeah, we have, and there's the whole world of the sales tech stack has kind of exploded over the past 2 to 3 years, and interestingly, what we're seeing is that companies are starting to kind of think like trying to consolidate, like, hey, do we need as many tools? But ultimately, the need is there, and I think there's the expectation as well. Like, the expectation from a lot of SDRs coming into the world is that they're a lot more informed about what a sales tech stack actually looks like, and there is kind of an expectation on their front that companies should have these things in place. It's important to them when they're choosing which company they want to work for.
And when you view like licenses and software, you mentioned kind of companies want to consolidate that now. Are you finding that companies still will have maybe 3 tools around data provider? Because obviously the more data that an SDR get, well, we'll get to the semantics, whether that's true or not later, but the happier they are, the more they're fed. Or do you find companies are now going, okay, we've had like 4 or 5, let's get this down to 1? And is that the right decision?
I think I see kind of a blend, and ultimately every company is kind of fighting for, every salesperson in the sales tech space is fighting for market share in that kind of tools budget. That's the big challenge. But I think there's a recognition that companies are all investing heavily in the sales development functions. That's for sure. You can see with the number of roles that are open out there, and so what we often find is that there's maybe more of a desire than ever to invest in the right tools and to make their SDRs successful, whether that's investing in one tool or a number of tools. But it's certainly the trend is that we're seeing that companies are committed to investing in this space, because otherwise why hire salespeople and SDRs if you're not going to set them up for success?
And Callum, I imagine you come across this a fair bit in your conversations as well. Being the nature of the job in the SDR role, I suppose everything will be drawn back to just the ROI and the sales funnel of any one tool. Do you think that's kind of like the right way to look at any software with a pure numbers hat on, or do you think there are softwares that are just kind of like the bread and butter for an SDR, and an SDR just can't function without them, irrespective of?
Yeah, I think it's always important, if you're the buyer, to be like assessing that what you're buying can generate an ROI, and I think that it's the salesperson's responsibility to facilitate that for them. I think there are some fundamentals, like non-negotiable like points. I'd like to just go back to something that Rich said there about like SDRs having, or any salesperson having more of an awareness about what a sales tech stack actually is and what that could look like. I think there's a real responsibility on sales leaders to make sure that they understand what their stack is, why they've brought it in, and there isn't necessarily like a FOMO basically on particular things. Like quite often we'll engage with companies that have bought too many tools and they don't communicate with each other, or there's a bit of a paralysis for their team because they just don't know where to log in the morning and where to start. And I think that's potentially a little bit of a downside of how freely information is shared and communicated on particularly LinkedIn, that you kind of hype up that FOMO element. But yeah, I think there is a breaking point on how many tools that like people use, and the leading brand names at the moment have got savvy to the point that Rich made about that consolidation point. And you've definitely seen lots of the familiar names that we'd come across diversify. But once again, that will create opportunities for other suppliers to come in and do a niche really, really much more effectively. And so it's quite cyclical, is my perspective. You can say something there, Rich.
No, I agree. I think everybody's looking for the next best thing to help them get those marginal gains in their team, aren't they? So, there's still, there will be a new emergence of sales tools for sure over the coming years. But again, I think the key point I'll just make is that there has been a trend that shows there's a commitment to invest in the sales development function more than ever over the past 2 to 3 years, and I think SDRs are becoming more aware of tools, and that's their expectations. When they join companies, they want to see what I get asked questions when people join my team, like what tech stack do you have? I mean, it's a question that people just wouldn't have never have asked 5 years ago. So
sure. I think that kind of like segues quite nicely onto the wider topic of the webinar, and that's around kind of like the churn and reducing ramp time of the SDRs. I think we've done well here to kind of set the scene of why it's such a prevalent topic. When we were discussing obviously beforehand what are the main areas we wanted to cover on this webinar, one thing that came up is the kind of the great resignation. I feel like I'm sick to death of hearing about it on LinkedIn, and people kind of roll their eyes at it. So we won't kind of maybe use that buzzword a lot. But there definitely seems to be, particularly in sales, particularly in the SDR role, almost like a changing of the guard of if SDRs aren't getting what they want in one company, whether that be sales tech stack or support or coaching, people are just kind of upping ship and moving, and probably spurned on by coming off the back of lockdown and people looking to greener pastures. But what have your guys' views been on the Great Resignation? Have you guys felt the sting yourselves?
So from a personal perspective, no, I would say, albeit it's very obvious, it's a very real thing, and you see a lot of people more than ever on LinkedIn switching jobs. You hear a lot in the market of how competitive it is. The job, it's a candidate's job market. There's more demand for talent than ever before, and because of that demand, the packages that are being offered are going up. Incentives are going up, and all the while, I think companies have to look at, well, what can we do to retain our best people, and that doesn't always come from paying them more money. But yeah, I think like from a personal perspective, I haven't seen it, because I think there's things that we're doing as a business to kind of mitigate against that. Albeit it's very obvious that this is a real thing when you see the number of job switches that are happening in the market. In addition to how competitive it is out there for talent, people are resigning. The key there is resignation. It's not like the great firing. It's not the great redundancy. It's the great resignation, as in people are leaving companies to go and want to work elsewhere.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned there that you're doing things to mitigate that, and we'll come back to that in a second when we're doing my job. But just keen to hear kind of Callum's view on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing I'd point anyone towards, went to sales confidence events. A guy called Grant Coleman spoke about it just for about 7 minutes and just kind of summed up some really good points on the topic. And that'd be an area that I'd point anyone to go and look at. I think the more recent Christmas, January period has certainly shown that I mean, the amount of people who logged in on 1st of January who had a different job role, was, I think Rich alluded to there. One of the interesting nuances, I think, most SDR managers, this could be their first time going through a January and actually experiencing that, because last January we were in a lockdown. No one was thinking about moving roles, and so I think the COVID context has really added to the feeling or the visibility of it. But it's also a non-sustainable trend. It will only take a few changes, some significant things going on in the world that might make the market a little less bullish, and there will be a marginal tick down. Hopefully, not too much of a big one. So, whilst it is a topical subject, I think it's important to for any sales organization just to maintain their integrity. I think make sure that you're still growing and nurturing talent. Make sure you're not breaking wage brackets and wage structures because you feel you need to. It's a temporary phase, I think.
Sure. You mentioned SDR managers maybe being the first kind of January they've come across. Were you seeing these trends then? So it might seem blatantly obvious, but were you seeing these trends like that 2019 then in January's bygone before COVID?
Basically 30% of SDRs that join a role as a graduate, not necessarily with experience. I think it would be fair to map your business on 30% of them not working out in the first 6 months. And our SDR business historically over the last 10 years, you would essentially plan for about 18% churn on average, somewhere between 15 and 25 SDRs moving on. I think that's just important context for people to know before, during, or after the Great Resignation. It's a role that people don't historically stick in forever. And last year, if you were an SDR manager for the first time going into 2021, you probably had 100% retention. This year, it was probably been a bit of a shock that a few people might have moved on. That's I suppose the point I was making. Sure.
I think when we were looking at kind of the stats with the average tenure of an SDR, I think I saw were 12 to 14 months. It's certainly creeping upwards though over the past few years. It's kind of as I mentioned at the start, solidifying itself in the sales funnel. Do you think that's fair? That's the trend you're seeing, or do you think COVID's also masking that by the fact that yes, the average tenure is going up, and that's because for the past 2 years people weren't really looking afar?
I'm not entirely sure of the source of that information and over how long a period that's been measured, but you'd have to imagine that COVID has had an impact on that.
Yeah, I would agree to that, where people are just they're looking to just be happy in a role. But I think there's also maybe what's happening in the market as well when it comes to SDRs is that there is more of an appreciation that you can make good money as an SDR, if you're successful, and also the fact that it is becoming more of a real desirable role. It's kind of especially in the tech space, it's seen as a really attractive world to be walking into, and so there's maybe more of from a perspective of the people happy to do that role for a longer period of time, as long as their company is seen as investing in their growth and their development, which is super key.
Sure. Okay, that kind of ties on, Rich. You mentioned you were taking steps to kind of mitigate losing great talent in the SDR role in Refract. To obviously make those steps, you must be fully aware of the reasons someone would move or someone would look past. What are those reasons classically? And for the sake of this conversation, I think it's probably key to forget a larger salary jump or something like
Yeah.
that. Because under the surface, it's normally not that, is it?
Not always. No. I mean, I think if you look at the statistics around why people want to leave companies, it's because, top of the list is they don't feel like their development is being invested in, and that development is in their skill set, but also how they progress in the business as well, how they progress in their career. And sadly, it's still happening. Like I see it from the interviews that I conduct with candidates. Of like, you ask them when was the last time you, like, we in our interviews with SDRs, we'll do like a role play with them, like something as simple as role playing a cold call, and then we'll literally give them in-depth feedback and coaching after the call. And even the ones that we don't hire, they say, this has been the most value I've had from a coaching perspective in an interview than I've had in the last 9 months. Which is on one hand great to hear from a selfish perspective, but also it's quite alarming, isn't it? It's like you're getting more coaching in a job interview than you are actually in from your, the person who's paying your wage. And people take that really seriously. People leave companies because they don't feel like they're getting stale. They don't feel like they're getting any better. They're no better today than they were last month. And it's crazy when you put it that way, that this huge investment that you've laid out, Freddie, 90 to 100 grand that's getting spent on SDRs, as Callum's pointed out, a big decent chunk of those aren't going to work out. Yet companies are still kind of just throwing them in and just saying, hey, make it happen. Go and watch some content on LinkedIn. There's loads of great stuff on LinkedIn, and invest in your own self-development and all this kind of stuff, which is obviously what everyone should be doing, but they're not taking a proactive approach to onboarding them, coaching them, creating that pathway, making them successful, making them, why do most salespeople want to leave companies? Because they don't feel successful. They're not making good money, basically. They feel like they're letting, they haven't got a lot to show for their efforts. How do you change that? Well, you change that by helping them get better as individuals. So, just some perspectives from me. I don't know if Callum sees anything different.
I actually think it's a really simple question to answer. Maybe my perspective isn't right on the money, but just ask yourself, why am I still at the company that I'm at? Or why did I leave the last company? And, Rich, obviously, you're co-founder, so maybe slightly different context. But for me, I've been at a company for, in September, 9 years, touching a decade. And it's a really simple thing. You write down the equation of why you're still here. And that's what you need to be providing every employee. And those things, money is a factor, but very rarely the top one for the majority of people, in my experience. Progression, recognition. You touched on coaching. I think feedback is the right kind of feedback is critical. Growing skills. There's a mental health, well-being, happiness, mission. You can't factor for once in a while someone wants to live in a different country or something like that. Maybe that's less of an issue these days anyway. But I think most people watching this or trying to solve this problem could answer the question themselves quite easily.
The key point that you've kind of both mentioned is I don't want to use the word kind of like self-worth, but kind of like words of enemy. But as a person, you need to feel kind of like valued in that company. And quite often that boils down to just whether you're performing in an SDR and sales role, for example. Is really easy. You've got targets, you've got KPIs which you need to hit, and if you're not hitting them, irrespective of everything else, it certainly feels like that can get you down and change your mentality. Is that what like the kind of like crux of what you're both like trying to say around like hitting those targets being key? Or
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, I think which salesperson who's feeling successful means that they're excited to come to work, to show up. They want to be doing well for themselves. They're getting recognized. They're making good money. Which salesperson wants to walk away from that environment? Where, and that's just it comes down to, well, how do you keep salespeople happy? You make them feel successful, make them feel rewarded. How do you do that? Well, you invest in developing them. You don't just kind of, sit around and say, oh, well, maybe they'll turn things around in 2 months' time. We'll give it 2 months and see what changes.
Sure, and that feels like, obviously we're talking about, or it feels like the conversation's been around kind of like experience bedded in salespeople, but the nature of kind of like the SDR job, it's normally quite young people, first job. There seems to be like a tenacity to maybe get that first like 3-6 months and success in that, maybe more so than any other job. That it's like important to feed in that success. Now, it's great if you can, and we're probably not going to be able to sit here and say SDRs can be like the best they can be in 6 months. Like, I'm sure Rich, Callum, you're still having some shocking calls yourself. But how do you make sure that SDRs new to the job are feeling that success in the first six months to keep them motivated to continue?
Callum, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah. I think a management and support structure of people who have ultimately done the job themselves and there can genuinely be a mutual respect and empathy for the role, I think is key. A clear identification of when the balance tips on someone wanting to prove to themselves that they can do this to a point that they feel that they are effectively doing it. And that is really the key moment in year one, I think, to address with someone what's next, what they need to continue to develop as well. And obviously, I think any way that you can work out what's actually happening in conversations on both sides and like offer feedback, and also how you can put someone, I think swings of the bat would maybe be a phrase I'd use, like how many times people are actually in a selling environment.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. SDR rules really hard, right? And it can make them, they can lose confidence and faith fairly quickly. Hence why so many, don't last very long, because it's a tough job. But what can you do to actually increase the chances of them feeling successful? Well, I kind of break it down into a few things. One of which that Callum's just hinted at there is that it can feel demoralized because you're spending so much time not actually having conversations with prospects. You're spending more time kind of sat speaking with nobody, and you spend these people are sitting in their spare bedrooms, a lot of these guys, and so they're not even feeling like they're actually able to give themselves a chance of booking a meeting. So the first thing is like, how do you actually improve the chances of them actually having more conversations with prospects? Because it's simply something as simple as having more conversations means that they feel like they're getting something out of their day, versus the SDR that says, oh, I've made a bunch of calls today, but I just didn't actually speak to anyone, feel like I've achieved nothing. Second aspect is from a fundamental coaching piece, whereas like, well, actually, what do they actually sound like when they actually speak with someone on the phone? If it's not on the phone, what do their emails look like? It doesn't have to just be doesn't just have to be calls. And being able to get them to self-diagnose, help them understand where they're going wrong. A lot of the time, they can makes them feel empowered when they're able to self-diagnose their own weaknesses. Even better if you can do that in group sessions. So we actually have one today this afternoon in our team, where we actually get one of the SDRs to lead on that kind of group session. And everybody gets a lot out of that session. They're all kind of sharing their own kind of war stories and things that they would do differently, and makes them feel like they've got some responsibilities. So that's the second piece. But the third piece I say is actually when you bring the person on board in the first place, is how do you actually get that person onboarded successfully? How do you actually make them feel like they're joining a professional environment versus, they've joined a new company, it's week one, and they're getting, a few presentations from the CEO or department heads about, this is what my department covers. this is our product, and then kind of like, okay, now go out and figure out how you can actually, go and make some cold calls. And sadly, that's what a lot of onboarding still looks like today for a lot of SDRs. They're being told loads of company stuff in their onboarding, but they're not actually being told the fundamental principles and frameworks to be successful. And that starts from day one. If you can show them that you're giving them the frameworks and you're giving them the skill set that they need to do that role specifically, then they'll feel like they've made the right choice. They're going to be set up for success, and they'll feel less like they're being thrown to the wolves.
Callum, yeah, go
on. I was going to say the comments from Jack Caligari now are both quite interesting on this particular topic. I mean, the one from Alan is in essence, if you're a company that can acquire the best talent, why do you need tech as well?
Yeah, I think going to Jack's comment there, celebrate the small wins, not just meeting books. I think that's a really pertinent comment, because not everybody's smashing out the park, 1 month into their new roles in SDR. Celebrate the small wins could be rewarding people on, hey, look who's had the most conversations with prospects today. Forget about how good or bad those conversations were. Let's just look at how many conversations someone's had. And we do this. We sell it. We have people who will do a call blitz and they'll say, hey, this is what my session just looked like. I made X number of calls and I had 3 conversations and I got 1 referral. I didn't book any meetings. And it's like everybody on Slack kind of celebrating that, hey, that actually sounds like a good use of an hour. You probably got more of an hour than some SDRs would achieve out of an entire day. And when we do it, when we've done our kind of prospecting days, we kind of also incentivize those things, like incentivizing conversations. Don't worry about how those conversations actually play out, or celebrating responses to emails, even if those responses were, go away, I'm not interested, but it's still something to feel like you're achieving something. Because if you can drive the activity, if you can celebrate the small wins, then you're gonna, the people who aren't yet booking tons of meetings are still gonna feel successful. Even better, here's another way that we can do it. Like, we still share in our team calls that have taken place in the team that, okay, they didn't end in a meeting, but they demonstrated good aptitude. It was a good opening. You got the prospect engaged in a conversation. The prospect went from saying, listen, I'm not interested, and you end up speaking with them for 8 minutes on the call. That's a good skill to have. And it's kind of celebrating those wins across the team, not just focusing on the outcomes, but focusing on what were the good bits about the components of the actual conversation. And even, we have again examples where in our own team we have a Slack channel that lights up when someone books a meeting on the phone, right? With the link to the call that took place. That's invaluable for a new SDR who's still trying to find their feet, who's still trying to get confidence, to then go, God, I want to listen to that call that took place 5 minutes ago from somebody else in the team. What did they say and do that got them a better result? So this doesn't just have to come from managers to drive this. This can come from within the team itself.
I think the small wins point and what you've just said, and there's a completely separate discussion about this, not one for today, but even with things like incentives for an SDR team, I always found that the small wins, little victories were so much more motivating for people rather than, I don't know, putting a PS5 in the middle of the room and saying top person this month wins. And that's certainly something which I think anyone watching this trying to motivate a team should consider, which is actually the smaller things. And the thing I like about a couple of your suggestions, Rich, is they actually require a recording and to dive back in. Like if to win the incentive you need to have handled an objection, you have to hear the other side of the call to know that, and then you're creating coaching environments just by running that incentive, which increases the likelihood someone's going to improve. So
it's impossible to coach someone to be better at sales if you can't hear the way they sell. It's almost impossible. You're just coaching them on, opinion or what they think they need or what you think they need. And sadly, we're not. Well, that's just, well, you could say it as sadly. Some people might not think it that way. We're not all sat in the office together anymore. In fact, the majority of teams aren't.
Hearing you, go on.
Just on the slide that you're presenting, Freddie, I think one of the more subtle things on there that I think can actually create problems for running a sales team is the clear career path and targets. I think the targets are simple, but mainly around the sales development role. If this is the first or maybe second job that someone's doing, I don't always feel like there's amazing context or knowledge about what an individual wants to really do with their first 10 years of their career. And they're often quite unsure about what it is that they want their next step to be. And I just thought it might be worthwhile just pausing on that point for a few minutes, because I see that as maybe one of the more challenging aspects of the three kind of pillars that you put up there, which is helping someone to make decisions about their career when maybe they don't have loads of ideas themselves.
It's an interesting one, because I think so many companies think that the progression for an SDR has to be SDR to account exec, and I think that's just such a narrow-minded view to have. I've got examples where people have joined the team here, they've done the SDR function, they've been good at the SDR function, but they realize that actually being account executive isn't really what they want. And they've had exposure to other sides of the business, but they've figured out in their head, like we've given them exposure to what being an account executive actually means and what it looks like, and they've decided, you know what, that's not what I want. And they've gone on to be amazing customer success managers. And they've built up a good skill set of being able to talk to people, which makes them good success managers, especially in our world where, they're able to, their customers are sales leaders and they have experience of speaking with those people. But for others, it's like, hey, I don't want to. Customer success doesn't interest me, but actually, what I'd love to do is become more. I actually really passionate about the SDR role. Some people can go on if they just love and they're successful and it works for them in their role, that they want to continue being an SDR, but they want more responsibility. For example, they want to be involved in onboarding other SDRs. They want to take more of a mentorship role for new SDRs, and that's fine. Like not everybody has to. We don't always have to say this, but you have to move on from this role. You might feel like you're really successful, you make the money you need, you get the job satisfaction, it fits in with your kind of work-life balance. And there's people who are, we need those people in the world. If everybody just wanted to continue doing something else, then we'd never have it would be hard, right? So I think it's a really important point you make, Cal, is like, understand what that person actually wants from a career progression perspective. And it doesn't necessarily have to be this default of you do this for a year and a half, 2 years, and then you move on to become an account executive, because for some people, that's not what they want.
And also on that point, I don't actually think that an SDR can have enough conversations in 1 year to be an effective account exec when they first start.
I 100% agree.
Like if you're having one to three good conversations a day with a prospect, you're not even getting anywhere near your 10,000 hours of skill generation. And yeah, I get why there's a pressure to kind of create progression for people.
It's a really valid point. Like, it's a super valid point. When you actually break it down, what most sales organizations and the number of conversations that they're actually having as an SDR, most sales SDRs, they're having actually a tiny number of conversations across a year, really. If you break it down, that they have maybe 1 or 2 conversations a day, like it's generally nothing, given the fact that some of those conversations may be a 10-minute conversation where the phone goes down quite quickly. So actual genuine sales conversations with prospects, it's actually might even be as low as 1 or 2 a week. So it's a super important thing, because how do you actually get people to develop their skill set? Well, you've got to give them more conversations. You've got to get them, and that comes back to making them feel successful. What isn't going to make them feel successful is if every day they're spending the entire day, hitting voicemails, not actually speaking with prospects, not even able to try and refine their craft.
Yeah.
We keep kind of like circling back round to actually like time spent, not just in seat, but in the phone, on the phone, having those conversations, or having an email exchange, or on LinkedIn or social media, whatever avenue you take. I suppose one thing that I've heard from sales leaders in particular is that there's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. We want to get people trained enough in the seat so they can have sales conversations. To do that, they need to be speaking to prospects and having conversations. To get those conversations, they need to be better at the job. So how do you ensure that SDR who probably hasn't got the skills to be able to get through to the right people, or hasn't got the skills to be able to engage them, are still getting that practice to have those sales conversations? It seems to be a catch-22.
Well, I think there's the one side of it is you have to invest in tools and technology to help with that. It's not a magic bullet. And here's the thing: the world is very different now to what it was 2 years ago. A lot of our prospects sat at home. Sat in the office. They're not plugged into their desk phone like they once were. Some prospects are just, if you're still trying to get through to people by dialing a head office switchboard number, you kind of, in a lot of cases, you're wasting your time. So you need good quality data to find people who actually answer the phone. First of all, so basic to say that, but that's key. The second aspect is that if they're not having conversations, you need to be practicing with them. If you can't get them having real conversations, you need to be mimicking real conversations. And yes, that involves role playing. And I know that word might make people cringe. Switch role play for practice. Makes you feel better, right? It's the same thing, but you should be doing it. And if you're not doing this like on a regular basis, especially if your reps aren't having real conversations on a regular basis, then they're never building that muscle memory. And again, like, practice doesn't have to be like, there might be some people watching this thinking, but hey, I don't really know how to cold call myself, so how can I practice with a sales rep? Or I don't have the time to do it. Well, get them practicing with each other. We found a good thing to do. I've had this approach where you get 3 SDRs together. You get them on Zoom if they're not sat with each other. Get someone playing an observer. The other 2 practicing the call, and the observer feels empowered. They feel like they can contribute to giving feedback and sharing what they heard. And it works really nicely. And I've never ever once had. I've had salespeople that say, "Oh, I hate the idea of role play," but once they've actually done it and they've done it properly, they're like, "You know what? That was actually, I got a lot out of that." So yeah, invest in tools, invest in data that gives them more conversations. If you're not doing that, you need to be practicing with them.
Yeah, that practicing a role play is so important. One, before kind of you gagging to comment on it, one like tip that I heard and helped when I was in the SDR role is that triad almost is really, really useful. And the way to remove the awkwardness that seems strange at first, but then when you're in flow, it's just for those other 2 SDRs just to sit back to back. It also emulates like that phone conversation a lot more. So yeah, just wanted to throw that tip in there. Like that's a really great setup with 2 SDRs back to back, 1 person observing. Yeah, you'll be amazed at how much simpler the role playing can become. Go on, Callum.
I think I was going to make some points around the use of technology from a managerial perspective. Like, you could buy all the data in the world, but a valuable exercise to do is actually just sit down with someone and go through their workflow and how are they actually using the resources that they have. You spoke about how can you generate conversations if you're not having any. Like, it's a simple thing. If you only have the switchboard operator's number, are you calling up and you asking 5 or 6 really smart, intelligent questions in the right tone, not confrontational, but just trying to understand more about, is anyone coming into the office? Is there a company policy you'll never put numbers through? Like, you get the picture. And then I think maybe the second point more around Rich talking about kind of coaching, whether that's in the Zoom environment you spoke about or using a tool like Refract. It really just comes down to, what are you coaching someone on about their sales calls? Is it the structure of the call, or are you focusing on like product and handling objections? And it's just like, it's such a subtle difference. But actually, I think at the SDR level, it's so much more important to understand how to have a conversation with someone, than it is to understand what your product does.
Yeah.
And there's a real disparity between the amount of time that organizations spend on their product or their service comparatively to actually just the dynamics of a call or a conversation.
Why do you think that is, Callum?
An obvious one would be a confidence in talking about actually how a conversation goes, from a coaching, managerial, or onboarding perspective. Pride. We've invested X million in developing this tool, and like we're going to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's very fair.
Could be another.
I think that's I definitely think that second point, you know, they want to shout and be proud about what they've built. But how many companies who are hiring SDRs? It's a very maybe prod on the bear type question. Have actually, like, which hiring managers have actually done the role themselves? When I say done the role, have actually done the hard yards, have done the slog of making the calls. I'd say a lot of companies out there who are hiring SDRs would not even have the single clue about how to actually, what a structure of a great cold call actually looks and sounds like. It's not their fault, so to speak, because that's just they never did the role. That's not the background they came from. But that is a cause for concern that you're hiring somebody who doesn't know the role themselves, but you're expecting them to do a role that you've never done before. And that's why if you're in that position, you need to be looking at, well, okay, if I don't have the expertise to be able to teach that, who out there does have the expertise?
Yep.
Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're basically expecting someone who's perhaps fairly young, new in their career, they're passionate about getting into this industry, but what they're hoping for is an education. You know, they're hoping to be taught, like, hey, I don't need to. Of course you know everything about your product, like you built the thing, but that doesn't help me understand how and what to say when someone picks up the phone who doesn't know who I am.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, you know, a lot of companies should be looking outside of the box of like, okay, if we don't have this expertise in house, let's not just expect our SDRs to magically think of this stuff up in their dreams. Let's actually look for outside support to help us change that.
Certainly, and I think that plays back also into the first of the two things that I mentioned before about sitting down and going through a workflow with someone and how they're actually using these things. Because something that I've seen you post, Rich, before, and other people at Refract, and I know there's a similar sentiment on the Engage Tech side, is that I'm pretty confident my number's in the open domain, and my phone has never rung in the last few years for a cold call, and I probably would take it if someone called me. When I say take it, I mean answer and just have a conversation with them. And the fact of the matter is, I think if you don't have that historical context as a manager of someone that has done this in the past, you are less likely to know that if someone's saying I made 50 dials today and didn't connect with anyone, that's a coaching point in itself. It's not just like something that you need to accept. And
100%.
Sure. Have you had any cold calls recently, Rich? Has anyone called you?
I had a missed call off a number I didn't recognize yesterday. I couldn't answer because I was literally on a call. But it's not the number isn't exactly increasing, Callum. So, but yeah, I get a lot of emails. Get a lot of emails.
I know someone at our company, the sales director Paul McCarthy, replies to LinkedIn with emails being like, "This sounds great. Can you give me a call?" And he's got some stats which I can't remember now about the amount of calls he gets and the amount of people replying just straight away, trying to just reply back on email or email on LinkedIn. It's certainly prevalent.
Yeah.
Look,
one of the things that I was going to say, sorry, just quickly on the small wins earlier, you guys, I'm probably going to use the wrong phrasing, but you guys on Fact have got like a kind of scenario feature, which I think is really good for this kind of stuff, where you as a manager can essentially say, all right, I'm throwing this objection at you, and you know you got to count down 3, 2, 1 to prepare, and then just like go and do it.
Yeah. So we've actually got Jake on my team's actually running this exercise this afternoon, where he's we trying to improve our messaging on following up on different inbound leads, and so the challenge has gone to the whole sales team of like, you've got this inbound lead, they've attended this webinar. What would you say to the prospect? What's your message? And it kind of gets people to hear how everybody else in the team, what they would say and do, and lets people take the best bits from different people. And again, kind of ties into that, like, that's, if you want a culture where people feel like they're empowered to take part in those things and get better and learn from others, then that all leads to job satisfaction, right?
Yeah. And it goes back to the chicken and the egg scenario here of that we've mentioned a few times, which is, if you're doing those kinds of things, people build a confidence, which means they're more likely to say, all right, there's only 30 minutes on the clock, but I actually think if I get through to someone, I'm going to succeed. And so they're so much more likely to put in the extra effort to try and have a few connections, and it snowballs in a positive way.
Right, 100%.
I read a book about cold calling years ago. The author escapes my mind, but he went into an IBM style business and spoke to all of the graduate sales reps and spoke to the number one person and said, what was the differentiator for you to mean that you ended up finishing top of your like year one graduate scheme? And he just said, I just made one more call every day. I just made sure when everyone else was logging out, I just continued to prospect until I had one more conversation.
Yeah. I used to do a similar thing where, when I used to work in a shared office space in London, I used to say, hey, I always used to say on a Friday, whenever people used to stand up and say, right, we're going to go to the pub for beers now, I always had that as my trigger to say, I'm going to make 10 more dials before I join them in the pub for a beer. And it was just like little things like that that kind of motivated myself really to want to be successful. I just picked a couple of questions in the chat. From Al said, do you think creating a competitive environment between SDRs can lead to poorer opportunities being put forward and less customer retention as a result? Or do you think it drives the Thai team forward? I think competition's always healthy. Well, competition's good as long as it's healthy, as long as people see it as it's not cutthroat, that people feel like they're supportive of each other. Competition can drive people forward, but don't always assume that the incentive, like, as Callum said, like a PlayStation, for example, might not be that important for some people. Actually, an extra, like a half a day's annual leave extra free might motivate some people even more. Don't just assume that one incentive fits all.
Yeah. And I think my answer to that just comes back to what's on the screen now, which is it comes down to a quality of conversation. As long as you are quality checking around the incentive to make sure that standards haven't dropped, you get the best of both. But one of the big traps in running SDR teams is just focusing on that booked number. It's critical. You need to have a volume focus, and you need to have a team that are motivated. But there are some underpinning, like, leading indicators of whether or not that's the only thing you need to focus on.
Cheers. And we've got one more question from James as well. You can see it in the chat. He's written, like, the hardest thing for an SDR is having a natural conversation. Do you think sales teams are being too analytical at times and overcomplicating a sales call? Well, we've only got 2 minutes left. Let's try and keep this answer to maybe 10 seconds each and try and be succinct. Could be a good exercise. Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in then. I don't know really. I think where the SDRs go wrong is that they don't have a clear structure as to what a call, like, just a framework to use when making calls. So I actually think they probably make the call more complicated because they don't have a structure to work from. Is where I typically see them being fall downs. Which in a sense makes it say that actually having a simplicity is best. But you've got to have a structure for simplicity.
Yeah, I support that massively. It's like, if you've got if you could sell into loads of different sectors on any given day, just focus on one of them, have a good list together, and just repeat. You don't have to overthink it, and then you can focus on your volume. There's a way that you can create structure to mean that you don't have to overcomplicate things. It's just that extra degree of planning that Rich put his post up about the number 4 bus the other day, and just using his, like, commute as a way to plan. I think it was names that you were talking about on there, but you could look at that differently. Who am I going to prospect into next week, what sector am I going to focus on? Simple stuff, but not that obvious if it's your first ever job.
That's brilliant. Well, that brings us to 2 o'clock, which I think is our allotted time. Really insightful from both yourself, Callum, and Rich. Again, I think the crux of what we're saying across the whole webinar is that speed to conversation, making sure that SDRs feel value, feel like they're being successful. And by doing that, by underpinning them and making sure they've both got the coaching, but also the tools to be able to go out there and feed on that success. But yeah, cool. We'll wrap up. Cheers, Callum.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers,
Cheers, everyone listening.
Take it easy. Bye.
Bye now.